In the stillness of the room, Seneca stood alone. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the cold stone walls. The blade gleamed before him, silent, patient, yet he did not run. He knew what was coming. The man who had once advised emperors was about to meet his end. The silence of the room was broken only by the faint sound of Seneca's breathing, slow and deliberate. In a quiet voice, he spoke almost as if the words themselves were reluctant to leave his lips. It wasn't a guillotine. It wasn't poison. Nero had given him a choice. Slit your wrists and die like a stoic. His wife stood beside him, her eyes filled with both disbelief and sorrow. In the moments that followed, Seneca didn't scream. He remained calm, his face unreadable. The room filled with blood echoed only the quiet sound of a life being extinguished. But how did the most respected philosopher in Rome become a target for death? How did the great teacher, the man who had once spoken with wisdom and virtue, come to be seen as a threat to the very empire he had helped shape? To understand Seneca's death, we must first understand Nero, the boy who was never meant to rule. Seneca was not born to bleed. He was born to speak, to write, to challenge the very essence of power with the sharpness of his words. Born in Cordoba, Spain, his youth was marked by scrolls, silence, and a relentless ambition to make sense of the world. A prodigy in his own right, Seneca's path was always destined for greatness. But greatness, like all things, comes with a price. In Rome, his words cut sharper than any blade. He was a philosopher whose intellect rivaled that of any senator, and his influence reached further than the empire's greatest generals. They called him the man who could talk emperors into tears, a title that earned him both admiration and fear. But it wasn't just his words that made Seneca dangerous. It was his ability to see through the facades of power, to peel back the layers of corruption that had begun to fester within the empire. In a world where emperors played, God, Seneca stood as a voice of reason. Then came Nero, a boy of chaos, a student who idolized his teacher. But what Seneca didn't know was that this boy, this shadow of a ruler, would be the very one to betray him. In teaching Nero, Seneca believed he was saving Rome. He didn't know Rome was already set to burn. As Nero's reign progressed, the boy Seneca had once guided became something unrecognizable. No longer a student, Nero had become a god in his own eyes, and gods do not tolerate advice. The man who once listened now wielded a power that consumed everything in its path. Seneca tried. He wrote letters, he gave speeches, he reminded Nero of philosophy and virtue. But virtue had long since been replaced by greed and ambition. The palace, once a place of learning, had become a breeding ground for corruption and betrayal. The letters became less frequent, the advice less effective. Seneca's words no longer held sway. The once great philosopher found himself isolated, surrounded by the very people he had once trusted, but now saw as nothing more than pawns in a ruthless game of power. One morning, Seneca awoke to a chilling reality. 2 of his closest friends had been executed. No trial, no reason, just blood on marble. The empire had made its move, and Seneca was no longer seen as a teacher, but as a threat that needed to be silenced. The end had begun. Seneca could no longer ignore the signs. His influence was slipping, and Nero's power was growing unchecked. Seneca's own life was now in danger, but his intellectual fight remained strong. Even in the face of death, he stood as a symbol of defiance. A messenger arrived at Seneca's villa. There were no guards, no weapons, just silence. Nero had sent an order not to execute him, but to let him die on his own terms. A final insult, a final test. A man who had once stood at the top was now condemned. Nero's decision to let Seneca die by his own hand was an act of cruel humiliation. It was as if the emperor wanted to prove something, maybe to himself or maybe to the empire. Seneca's death was no longer just about politics. It had become a symbolic act. Seneca did not resist. There was no anger, no plea for mercy. Instead, he nodded, turned to his wife, and in a voice that barely broke the silence of the room, said, "Help me bathe. It will be the last time I ask for anything." The words were gentle, yet heavy. The act of dying, of surrendering to the inevitable, became a final lesson in stoicism, a lesson Nero would never learn. Seneca slit his wrists slowly, the blood flowing warm and steady like ink from an ancient scroll. His wife begged him to stop, but Seneca held her hand. Seneca's final moments were marked by a strange calmness. He told his wife to live, to carry on. The quiet sorrow of the moment stood in stark contrast to the violent world outside. His death was not an end. it was a solemn acceptance of a fate already sealed. As the oil lamps dimmed, Seneca's voice faded. There were no screams, no dramatic last words, only silence. In that silence, Rome lost its last voice of reason. The empire had extinguished its final flicker of wisdom, leaving only the darkness of a misguided ruler. The villa was silent after Seneca's death, but outside rumors screamed. Whispers spread across the empire that Seneca had died with dignity, while Nero had none. His death was not just the loss of a man, but the death of the last voice of reason in a crumbling empire. And as Nero laughed louder, the laughter echoed in emptier halls. The empire once great was now set on a path of destruction. Seneca's death was not the end, it was a harbinger of the greater rot that had taken root in the heart of Rome. But Seneca's legacy lived on. His words survived the fire smuggled out by slaves passed down through generations. His letters, his scrolls, his teachings became the foundation for centuries of rebellion, of revolution, and of thought. His ideas refused to die with him. In the end, Seneca became a symbol not just of a man who died in silence, but of a timeless truth. Sometimes the greatest light comes after the darkest night. His death, tragic as it was, ignited a flame of thought that would burn long after the empire had fallen. Rome, once a beacon of power and wisdom, now stood in ruins. Nero's laughter had long since faded, but the echo of it could still be heard in the desolate streets. The empire's decline had begun long before Seneca's death, but his passing marked the final blow. The Senate, once the heart of Roman authority, was now a shell of its former self. Senators, once powerful men, had become mere puppets in Nero's chaotic reign. And yet the teachings of Seneca remained etched into the minds of those who still dared to think beyond the empire's madness. While Nero basked in his false divinity, there were whispers among the people, whispers of a man who had stood against the tide, a man who had spoken truth to power. Seneca's legacy became the foundation for those who would one day rise up against tyranny and oppression. Seneca's death may have seemed like an end, but in reality it was the beginning of something greater. His words inspired revolutions, his philosophy challenged the established order. In a world where rulers like Nero sought to crush all opposition, Seneca's legacy proved impossible to erase. The empire may have fallen into chaos, but Seneca's voice lived on. His death was not in vain. It served as a stark reminder that even in the darkest times, reason, virtue, and truth could still find a way to survive. The power of his ideas transcended the fall of Rome. Seneca's final lesson wasn't just about dying with dignity. It was about living with purpose even in the face of corruption. His life, his philosophy had been a quiet rebellion against the excesses of Roman power. In death, he became a martyr for reason. The whispers about Seneca's death spread far beyond the walls of Rome. In distant lands, his teachings began to take root. Rebels, philosophers, and those who opposed tyranny found solace in his words. Seneca's message transcended borders, inspiring a new generation of thinkers. Nero, meanwhile, continued to spiral into madness. His reign became increasingly erratic, and the empire he ruled began to crumble. Seneca's absence was felt in every corner of the empire, but it was too late to turn back. Rome had already set itself on a destructive path. Seneca's death had not only silenced a man of wisdom, but it had also signaled the collapse of a philosophy that had once guided Rome. The Stoic principles Seneca had championed, the ideals of self-control, virtue, and rationality, were discarded in favor of decadence and tyranny. But as the empire fell into disarray, a small group of Romans still held fast to the ideals Seneca had taught them. They became the quiet rebels of their time, working from the shadows to preserve the wisdom of the past. Their efforts would someday lay the foundation for a new world. In the years that followed, Nero's empire continued to rot. Senators were executed on a whim, generals were betrayed, and the people were left to suffer. But through it all, the memory of Seneca lived on. His death had been a tragedy, but it had also sparked something far more important: change. Seneca's death became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power. It showed the world what could happen when a ruler surrounded himself with sycophants and discarded those who sought to guide him. His demise was a cautionary tale for future generations of leaders. Rome's legacy, once built on philosophy and law, had been reduced to a shell of its former self. Yet Seneca's teachings continued to resonate with those who sought to rebuild what had been lost. His death had been painful, but his ideas remained untouched by time. And in the quiet corners of the empire, the idea of Stoicism began to take root again. The teachings of Seneca, once banished from the halls of power, found a new audience. His words became the foundation for movements that would challenge the corruption that had consumed Rome. Though Rome itself may have burned the fire that Seneca lit in the hearts of his followers, never truly went out. His teachings lived on, shaping the future of thought and proving that even in death, the power of reason and virtue could change the world. Years passed and the world beyond Rome took notice of Seneca's death. His teachings began to spread across Europe, influencing the intellectual landscape of distant lands. The philosopher who had once been a prisoner of Rome's politics was now free in the hearts and minds of many. Though Nero's reign was marked by chaos, Seneca's writings endured. His letters filled with wisdom were passed from hand to hand. Scholars, rebels, and citizens alike found themselves drawn to the simplicity and clarity of his thoughts. In a world clouded by conflict, Seneca's words were a beacon. Seneca had never sought fame or power. He had sought truth. In death, he became a symbol of the eternal struggle between reason and tyranny. His ideas continued to shape the minds of those who questioned the unjust systems of their own time, providing a steadying force in tumultuous times. By now, the empire had fallen into ruins, but the ideas that Seneca championed were alive. His philosophy, though once seen as radical, had gained respect across the world. A new generation of leaders, thinkers, and dreamers began to rise, inspired by the Stoic teachings that Seneca had laid out. As the empire crumbled, new civilizations rose in its place. Yet the memory of Seneca's death remained a stark reminder of the cost of corrupt power. His life, his death, and his ideas transcended time, living on in the hearts of those who dared to defy the status quo. The final hours of Seneca were more than just a tragic death. They were a moment of transformation. His silent defiance against Nero's tyranny became the blueprint for future leaders who sought to rule with wisdom rather than power, with virtue rather than greed. Seneca had shown that even in the face of certain death, a man could retain his dignity. His last moments, bathed in the soft light of the oil lamp, symbolized the Stoic philosophy he had lived by. In a world of corruption and cruelty, his death was a testament to his unwavering beliefs. In the years that followed, Seneca's words were quoted by philosophers across the world. His principles of self-discipline, justice, and virtue were taken up by those who sought to build societies that valued the common good over the lust for power. His death, though tragic, sparked a revolution in thought. And as the centuries passed, the story of Seneca's life and death became the stuff of legend. His name was spoken with reverence, not just as a philosopher, but as a martyr. The man who had dared to speak truth to power had left a legacy that would never be forgotten. Though Rome had fallen, Seneca's influence had only grown. His teachings continued to echo through the ages, shaping the minds of rulers, rebels, and thinkers alike. In the end, it wasn't the empire that defined him. It was the enduring power of his ideas that shaped the world. With the passing of time, Seneca's death was no longer just a historical event. It became a powerful symbol, a symbol of resistance against tyranny, of the triumph of reason over madness. His story was told and retold, each generation finding new meaning in his words and actions. As the centuries rolled on, scholars began to look back on Seneca's life with a renewed sense of admiration. His works were studied not just for their philosophical content, but for the courage with which he faced the end of his life. His stoicism was a model for enduring suffering. In the wake of his death, Seneca's philosophy took on a life of its own. It became the cornerstone of ethical thought in both Western and Eastern civilizations. From the Stoic schools of thought to the Christian philosophers who admired his principles, his influence stretched across time and space. Seneca's words found their way into the hearts of political leaders who sought to lead with justice. Though they may not have followed every word to the letter, the lessons of humility, restraint, and virtue shaped their decisions. In that way, Seneca's death had given rise to a new order. Even as empires rose and fell, Seneca's philosophy remained constant. His teachings were used as a tool for personal growth, for building resilient societies, and for challenging the corrupt systems that continued to plague the world. His death had made his teachings all the more potent. In Rome's ruins, the echoes of Seneca's death still lingered. His story became a warning, a lesson in the price of absolute power and the importance of self-reflection. Though Nero had sought to silence him, it was Nero's empire that had ultimately been silenced by Seneca's legacy. As time passed, the tragedy of Seneca's death took on new layers of meaning. It became a testament not just to the failings of one emperor, but to the cyclical nature of history. Once again, people found themselves in a world where power often corrupts and virtue is suppressed. The world that Seneca had left behind was far from perfect, but his teachings had helped create a better one. It was a world that still struggled with corruption, with tyranny, but one that also knew the value of wisdom, of self-restraint, and of the ability to speak truth to power. As the centuries passed, Seneca's teachings were no longer confined to philosophers and scholars. His words found their way into the lives of everyday people. His lessons on resilience and virtue helped them face their own struggles, becoming a guide for living with purpose in the face of adversity. Seneca's legacy endured not as a dead man's philosophy, but as a living, breathing force that continued to shape the world. His death, tragic as it was, marked the beginning of something greater. Through his ideas, the world learned that the greatest light can often come after the darkest night. Seneca's teachings spread like wildfire, igniting the hearts of those who yearned for a better world. His life, his philosophy, and his death became intertwined, inspiring generations to live with integrity and wisdom. His words became a beacon for those lost in the chaos of life. In distant lands, Seneca's philosophy continued to shape the minds of leaders and thinkers. His thoughts on virtue ethics and the human condition became fundamental to the development of new schools of thought. His death, though tragic, had turned him into a timeless symbol of intellectual strength. The story of Seneca's demise was retold countless times, each retelling adding layers of meaning. It wasn't just a tale of betrayal by a tyrant, but a story of courage in the face of impossible odds. His final act of self-inflicted death became a symbol of stoic resilience. Even as the empire that had killed him faded into obscurity, Seneca's philosophy endured. His ideas remained a constant throughout the ages, influencing leaders, thinkers, and citizens alike. They became the foundation for movements that sought to build societies that Seneca's philosophy became the framework for ethical leadership. Leaders who took his teachings to heart sought to rule with wisdom, temperance, and justice. Though the world continued to be marred by corruption and tyranny, Seneca's ideas inspired those who believed in the possibility of a better world. In every corner of the empire, from the lowest streets of Rome to the highest halls of power, Seneca's teachings were embraced. His death had been a tragedy, but his ideas were immortal. The lessons of self-control, virtue, and wisdom took root in the hearts of those who yearned for change. Seneca's legacy continued to grow as the centuries passed. His writings were studied in schools, discussed in intellectual circles, and applied by rulers who sought to better govern their people. His death, once seen as the end of an era, had turned into the birth of a new intellectual movement. Though Rome was no longer the powerful empire it once had been, Seneca's influence continued to shape the world. His philosophy was the antidote to the excesses of power, the corruption of greed, and the tyranny of kings. His death had marked the end of an empire, but the rise of wisdom. Seneca's teachings spread beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, inspiring philosophers, scholars, and activists across the globe. His death had been an end, but it had also been the beginning of something much greater, a legacy that would transcend borders, in time leaving an indelible mark on human history. As new generations arose, Seneca's ideas continued to resonate. They saw in him not just a philosopher, but a revolutionary. His teachings offered a path to resist the oppressive forces of power and to live a life of virtue even when the world seemed to conspire against them. In the face of adversity, Seneca's philosophy offered solace. His teachings reminded people that life's greatest challenges were an opportunity for growth, for embracing stoic resilience. The world outside might crumble, but one's inner strength remained unshaken, just as Seneca had shown in his final moments. Though Seneca's death had been a tragic moment in history, it had sparked a wave of intellectual curiosity. His writings, once confined to the elite, now reached a broader audience. His ideas about justice, reason, and virtue helped reshape societies even centuries after his death. Seneca had always believed that power unchecked was a force that could corrupt even the most virtuous. His own death had proven this truth. The world he left behind had not learned from his teachings, but in time, the lessons of his life and death would be rediscovered. The years following Seneca's death were filled with chaos, but they also marked the dawn of a new intellectual era. The ideals of Stoicism championed by Seneca began to take root in the hearts of many. Philosophers and rulers alike found in his writings the guidance they needed to lead with virtue. As Seneca's words spread through history, They became more than just a guide to personal resilience. They became the foundation for movements that sought to challenge oppression and corruption. His teachings were used as tools for political change, for social justice, and for the pursuit of a better world. In every generation, Seneca's philosophy found new advocates. His ideas were not confined to any one time or place. They transcended the ages. The world's leaders, thinkers, and activists turned to Seneca's words for inspiration as they navigated the complex struggles of their own eras. Seneca's death had not been the end of his influence. It had been the beginning. His ideas spread far and wide, helping to shape the intellectual landscape of Europe and beyond. What had once been seen as a personal tragedy became the catalyst for a global intellectual revolution. Even as new empires rose and fell, Seneca's philosophy endured. His teachings were passed down through generations, surviving wars, conquests, and revolutions. His death had been a painful chapter in history, but his legacy had become an unshakable force that continued to inspire and guide. Seneca's words lived on, not just in books or scrolls, but in the hearts and minds of those who believed in the power of virtue. His teachings provided a blueprint for navigating life's trials, offering solace in times of despair and wisdom in moments of confusion. In the end, Seneca's legacy was not defined by his tragic death, but by the timeless relevance of his philosophy. His teachings on virtue, wisdom, and self-control had outlasted the empire he had served. His words had become immortal, continuing to shape the world for generations to come. Through centuries of change, Seneca's teachings were not just a source of wisdom, but a rallying cry for those who resisted tyranny. His philosophy became a weapon in the hands of the oppressed, a way to find strength in adversity, just as he had done in his final hours. Seneca's influence stretched beyond philosophy into the realm of politics. His thoughts on power, leadership, and governance became key principles for those who sought to lead with justice. His death, once a personal tragedy, became the foundation of a new approach to ruling and governing. The silence of Seneca's final moments had been deafening, but his teachings were loud and clear. The lessons he had imparted about self-control, virtue, and wisdom rang out across the ages. They became the foundation for ethical leadership in a world often defined by the corrupting influence of power. In the centuries after Seneca's death, his ideas were woven into the fabric of various movements. From the rise of Christian thinkers who admired his stoicism to the Enlightenment philosophers who embraced his call for rationality, Seneca's influence was ever present, shaping the course of history. The world Seneca had left behind was still haunted by the darkness of Nero's rule, but his death became a turning point. It was a moment that illuminated the value of integrity and virtue, even in a world that seemed to reward cruelty and corruption. Seneca's death had revealed the dangers of unchecked power, but his philosophy offered an antidote. His life and writings became a guide for those who sought to balance authority with justice, wisdom with strength. The lessons of his life echoed across generations, offering a way out of darkness. Over time, the story of Seneca's life and death became more than a historical account. It became a parable, a reminder of the importance of maintaining one's principles in the face of overwhelming odds. His death was a tragedy, but his teachings made that tragedy meaningful. In the wake of Seneca's death, the empire began to unravel. Nero's excesses led to the empire's decay, but it was the memory of Seneca's integrity that continued to resonate. Even in the final days of Rome, his philosophy remained a beacon for those who sought a better way of life. As the centuries passed, Seneca's words found their way into the hearts of individuals across the world. His teachings on resilience, virtue, and the power of the mind helped countless people face their own trials. In every age, Seneca's philosophy remained a steady guide. The legacy of Seneca lived on through the centuries, not just in the words he wrote, but in the actions of those who followed his example. His death had been the spark that ignited a revolution in thought, and through his philosophy, generations of people found the courage to stand for what was right. Seneca's influence continued to spread throughout history. His teachings were revisited and embraced during times of societal upheaval, when people turned to philosophy for guidance. His stoicism provided an enduring foundation for those seeking a rational approach to life in a chaotic world. Even as new philosophies emerged, Seneca's Stoic principles remained a constant. His ideas about control over one's emotions, the importance of virtue, and the rejection of materialism continued to resonate in an ever-changing world. His death had been a spark, and his ideas kept the flame alive. Seneca's philosophy found its way into the hearts of revolutionaries. It was the calm amidst the storm, the guiding light for those who sought justice in a world rife with corruption. His words reminded them that true power lay in the self, not in external forces. As the centuries passed, Seneca's teachings were used as a compass to navigate the storms of personal and political life. His death had given rise to a new understanding of leadership, one that focused on wisdom, humility, and the responsibility of those who wielded power. The lessons of Seneca's life and death became the foundation for modern ethical philosophy. His ideas on justice, governance, and the role of virtue in leadership continued to influence politicians and thinkers. Seneca had given the world a philosophy that transcended time and place. Despite the erosion of the Roman Empire, Seneca's Stoic principles remained unshaken. The core of his philosophy, self-discipline, moral clarity, and inner peace, became a means of survival in turbulent times. His death had been a tragic chapter, but his words became an eternal guide for generations. In the years following Seneca's death, the empire continued to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Yet even as Rome crumbled, the teachings of the philosopher endured. Seneca's philosophy of virtue became the quiet rebellion against the chaos, providing solace to those who sought it. Seneca's death was not a simple loss, but a powerful catalyst for change. It had sparked a wave of intellectual inquiry, challenging the notion that power could exist without responsibility. His ideas reshaped the way people thought about governance, leadership, and personal morality. The Stoic principles that Seneca championed transcended his death. They became a roadmap for those navigating the complexities of the human experience. His philosophy on controlling one's emotions, valuing wisdom over wealth, and seeking virtue in the face of adversity offered a way out of the darkness. In the end, Seneca's legacy proved that even in death, a man can continue to influence the world. His life had been one of struggle and philosophy, and his death had been one of quiet defiance. Through his words, his teachings, and his example, he had ensured that his influence would never fade.